Yeah, there's like a little elevator on the side. It's not the top, it's not by the visitor's park. It's on the opposite side.
Or some other like funny costume. For my like total longevity, so you're going to give it like the next 2 years at like 25. Apply? I owe my marks. Came back today. In fact. I haven't got to see them. I just got told they were like fantastic results. Well done by the faculty.
Congratulations, man.
I will be getting a master's. They have labeled it a very different degree to what I thought I was getting though. Apparently I'm getting an MPhil.
That's pretty cool.
Which is the best one, so I mean that's fine.
Congratulations.
I thought it was an MA, but whatever.
You must have applied for something.
Yeah, I will. It's when I actually do hear the real results. It's like it's so fantastic in this like medium. But
fantastic for you.
Fantastic for you. You got 45 now.
Live streaming now.
That's fine.
People are hearing me talk about my mouth.
Yeah, we were talking about David excelling in his house.
live stream quick. Cool. Okay. And then, importantly, we have sponsors to thank. They have a lovely camera set up as well, so we can actually see it. And then Q Division as well. So I'll invite now, if you guys want to say anything, you can. And I know Q definitely does want to say something. They have sponsored the food and drink, which is vital to any good talk.
Always to keep it short, all that else to talk about.
Yeah, this is probably going to be too much. Okay, so the little intro to the people. I know you've seen some images. This is David. He sent me a better image. He thought it was better. I thought this was better. So I kept it like this. Which is great. There's also a beer, Castle Light, I think, hidden behind the name. So he has a Master's of Philosophy at UCT. He's also a lecturer and tutor there. And then he's generally very good at debating. And is a coach as well. So provincial coach, SA coach, and formerly head coach of the Western Cape. Then Neil Toit, he has a BSc in Maths, hardcore, and then decided to do law after Maths, which probably shouldn't have done it that way around. But he enjoys both. And then he's a data strategist at Q Division. And then, of course, myself, I'm Chris, and that's my topic. So I have a background in biochemistry, psychology, and computer science, which makes no sense until I say I'm now doing computational neuroscience. Oh, okay, that's fine. I say I'm an intelligence and intelligence systems specialist. Definitely not an expert. Definitely not an expert. Those are just things I want to specialize in, which is neuroscience and AI, and that's hopefully why you're here as well. A little bit of both, but definitely one. And then I do some AI mentoring, and then I do software and information architecture at Q as well. Cool. Hopefully there are no questions. I'm going to start with my talk now, and then the outline is, what is intelligence? The limits of intelligence, question mark, and understanding intelligence. Okay. Understanding intelligence, right? So, what is intelligence? The first step to solving a problem is to define it as clearly and precisely as possible. Which is a problem because intelligence is not clearly and precisely defined. Okay, there are about 10 different definitions just on the Wikipedia page, which is generally a person's go-to, and then so instead I just decided to go to Google and then chose their first definition as the working. Okay. So the ability to acquire and apply knowledge and skills. That's the working definition I'm going to do with intelligence. My reasoning for intelligence is you have some sort of person in the universe, and they will interact with the environment, and then they will gain knowledge from that environment. So they will form a knowledge base. And then they can test the knowledge base by acting upon the environment. And that feedback, you continuously gain your knowledge base by testing the environment, and that agent increases. So that's kind of like an intelligence agent. So they can acquire and then they can apply. Types of intelligence, you get some natural intelligence. Okay, so the first one would be evolutionary. So genetic mutations that are random from generation to generation. There's also something called epigenetics. How many of you have heard about epigenetics? Okay, cool. It's basically within a generation, something will happen that affects your DNA guided for the next generation. Whereas normal genetic mutations can be random, this one is actually based on what happened during your lifetime. The next generation affected. Neurobiological, so that's brain. And the final one, very interesting, very new, single cell habituation. They found that a slime mold was able to habituate. So that is apparently the simplest form of intelligence, thing of slime mold. Not all of them do it, it's one specific one, but it's an interesting thing nonetheless. Then artificial intelligence, which I imagine most of you are interested in. So that's software, which we can talk a lot about, and then some hardware as well, which is often neglected. So an aspect to like intelligent hardware would be memristor, where based on recent activation, it changes how likely it's going to activate next time. And then some neuromorphic engineering also has dynamic control or dynamics to it as well. So this is what I found online. It says artificial intelligence is making the computer think. It's different from normal programs in the way that the computer does not have a clear instruction on what to do, but has only on how to think. Anyone have overt disagreements with that? Learning and memory, very important aspects of intelligence. Very high level categorization of learning, supervised, unsupervised, reinforcement, and then meta learning on top of that. Anything you do you have anything to say?
What's meta
Learning how to learn. Difficult skill to define in itself.
You consider feature learning, meta learning, or as in like when you learn features for a related task to another task and you use that to pre-train neural network to learn better.
No, I wouldn't say that directly. But what does happen is in that sense of transfer learning, they do have sometimes an algorithm on top of that one that learns how to learn across multiple different parts. And that I would classify as learning. That might be as a consequence, but not as a direct mental learning. But I could be wrong. Okay, memory. Sensory memory could be like a reflex action, often the sensory memory. Short-term memory, working memory, and then long-term memory. So you have declarative, which is like events and facts. So episodic events, semantic facts, and then procedural, which is sometimes people say unconscious, or first say intuitive. So things you don't necessarily think about, how to play sport, for example. You don't consciously have to think about. That's procedural type of memory. A little bit more about short-term, because it comes up a lot in AI. Now extending towards better forms. So that's working memory over there. So chronological loop, that's replaying it a little bit. Visual spatial sketchpad, that's where you store vision and spatial information. It's similar, they're close to each other, but slightly different. And then episodic battle, so what has recently happened in that event. And then together your central executive, which is normally your prefrontal cortex in your brain, or in AI, whatever you decide to control the rest of them, that kind of makes them interact with each other in order to form some sort of working memory that is usable. An AI form of this has been inspired by the brain, and I'll talk a little bit more about neuroscience-inspired AI. Okay. Brief history of machine intelligence. I'm not going to go through every one, but pretty much it starts in the 1800s. Slightly just before then, with BSc, there were like inklings of formalizing it. Okay. Then, so BSc, very important in the 18th century. 100 years past, Markov chains are useful. Perceptrons, so that's discovery in 1950, 1980, cognitron, backpropagation in 1986, and then there's also decline as well in the use of AI in general. But what's important here is to see that this is like past, 300 years, right? That we've gone from nothing and have created something that people regard as intelligent. Okay, even if it's not general intelligence, it's still intelligence enough. So there can be an argument about like proficiency versus growth. Like how good is AI now? Okay, so it's not too bad. Like the growth from where it started to where it is now, it's crazy. Every 6 months, it's just like blows up. So yeah, things that happened 6 months ago. Okay, limits on intelligence. Survival evolution. So bounded natural intelligence. So this is limits on intelligence, artificial intelligence. Why natural intelligence could be bounded. Mainly thermodynamics. So the first graph on the left is body weight versus brain weight. And there's a proportion between body weight and brain weight on a logarithmic scale. And what's really interesting is humans are outliers. Dolphins are also fair amount of an outlier, but humans are more of an outlier. That's why whales aren't significantly smarter than us, even though their brain is actually so much bigger than ours. It's this proportion, right? And us being an outlier allows us to be more intelligent than relative ones as well on that proportion curve. Then there was a paper article in 2011. Person put forth why we probably cannot get much smarter, and he had a few reasons. And they pretty much boiled down to like you can't make things smaller than they are now because it gets too noisy. And in terms of like the axons of our neurons, basically how to transmit information along a wire, they can't do that. The other ones are like the required amount of energy. You can't just have a bigger brain with more space. You also have to then have transmissions across wider spaces. Also requires either bigger wire or more myelin, which basically means a whole bunch more energy. So there's a theory that says, well, there's limits of actually how smart we can get. And we're pretty much at the limit of it. But that is obviously debatable, which hopefully some people will be like, yeah. Okay. Artificial intelligence, question mark, thinking revolution. One of the biggest limits to AI is humans. Any responses? Yes, no, see some nods. No one's over it. Okay, why do you guys think biggest limit to AI is humans? Humans still develop AIs? Yeah, I suppose. Yes. Growth and bias? Yes. Oh, right, okay, so like a money, okay.
Isn't it actually done? They learn from the space and the subtitle.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah?
Generally, machine learning and all these sorts of things need to learn from some representation or structure of data. And generally, it's humans who interpret what sort of structural representation would be most useful to any particular machine. And at the point in which that's still relevant, they still won't become better than our misinterpretations of them.
Yeah, so they represent the underlying. Sorry, did everyone hear that? They represent the underlying bias of the data that we get. Did I summarize that very well?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. My main reason that I put that there is due to fear, perception, and hype. So that's why I have the hype cycle there, which is pretty much how technologies get hyped in social society. And people don't often interact with AI and machine intelligence, right? And when they do, it's generally sensationalist headlines. Okay. So if Facebook manages to shut down chatbot just before it could become evil. What? That's definitely not why they shut it down. It might have become evil, but that's definitely not why they shut it down.
Usually AIs that people put on the internet become incredibly racist.
Yeah,
Because of people deliberately trying to mislead them to become bad.
Yeah. So explicit example is Tay.
Yeah.
If you can see in this Twitter one here, can I just say that I'm super stoked to meet you. Humans are super cool. Ends with Hitler was right. I hate you. So less than 24 hours for people to make that chatbot become a racist, homophobic, feminist thing. That was a year ago. They now have a new one which doesn't learn from religion and doesn't learn from politics. And it's still becoming racist and sexist. So
conclusion should be drawn from that.
people are the limit to the AI. This is why we can't have nice things. So perception, fear, hype. Undoubtedly, people are going to use it for wrong things, or people think it's amazing and it's not going to live up to expectation, and then it's going to fall down again. So there needs to be a lot of discussion and like realism to AI. Okay. At the bottom, I've also said, sorry, not everyone can read it. Theoretically, AI is only limited by the laws on mathematics and thermodynamics. In other words, an AI will not be able to predict information that just isn't there, and it will have to deal with the energy cost of processing. So that's similar to neurobiological limits, right? But, we can't simulate the brain at the moment. If we do it, even then, as Currin can attest to, it takes forever to simulate a semi-realistic aspect of the brain. That even in many years, it may not happen. Anyway. Talking about limited intelligence, this is a list of 59 things AI can do. This was in March. It's really good. You can read through them while I talk. So these are very good examples also of specific tasks that they are good at. There are some AIs which are purposely built as general, but most of them are very specific. If you have other examples, I'd love to hear them. The architectures people use can be varied. You can use different architectures to have the same output. They come up with new ones all the time. I'm not going to talk about architectures today, fortunately. But there's all sorts of awesome things AI can do, and they have been able to do this in such a relatively short amount of time, which I think is incredible. Okay, so for those who do like artificial neural networks, I'm not going to go through what they are, what they do, why they're cool. But there was a question posed at the conference recently. How long until artificial general intelligence? So that's where AI is good at more than just one task and can be so they can do a lot of things in a lot of ways, or you can have a good conversation with it and something actually be very useful. And there were about 60 people who answered the poll, and at a conference are people who study AI. More than 50% of them said that it'd be really, we'd have AGI before 2050, right? Which is a crazy short amount of time. How many people think that we'll never get to artificial general intelligence? How many people think that we will get to artificial general intelligence? Okay. There's a difference in the number of hands. Some people just don't answer at all. I try to find it. So, being human-like. Human-like intelligence. Being able to interact. It's the real. Anyway, so I said about a whole bunch of stuff what AI can do, potential where it's going to go, what isn't it good at. First one, catastrophic forgetting. So that's when AI is trained on one task, and another task for like identifying cats. If it was able to do both of those, it would completely forget the other one. A good example is the one that they did reinforcement learning on DeepMind, on games, They could have one network that could play multiple games, but not the same network. So they have a network to play that game, they have a network to play that game, network to play that game. And the same network can play all the games, or most of the games, pretty well. But the same one can't play multiple. Does that make sense? Cool. But that has somewhat been addressed by something called continual learning, or is busy being addressed by continual learning, where they're actively trying to have a robust system. And it usually involves memory, a system usually external to the AI to help with what task is relevant and what's done. Remember, another problem, noise susceptibility. In the top right, the images of a car is blurred. The images of a car, left one says a car, the right one says a cat. Clearly not a cat. Okay. The reason they've added in a little bit of pixels and they specifically placed them there because certain aspects of the network were sensitive to those perturbations. Fortunately, so that's called adversarial perturbation. Fortunately, that paper, they were talking about a way to protect against it, which is very interesting, and they build a more robust representation of the same network. But not everyone's going to do that, right? So there are going to be circumstances where you can purposely trick an AI, and you can do it imperceptibly to a human, which is a problem. Then there's accountability, which I know Neil definitely is going to talk about. So that's black boxes of deep learning neural networks. Public perception, I mentioned that, was humans are limited to AI. And then creativity, imagination, and curiosity. A lot of people think creativity is like AI will never be able to do it. great human qualities. Does anyone want to define creativity? No? Okay. I heard a good definition by I think it was the head of DeepMind actually. Yeah. You know two things really well, two different things really well, and combine them. That's creative. Right? And it's normally creative when many people don't know those two things really well. So if I know neuroscience, I know artificial intelligence, I know them very well, and I cross-link them a little bit, I would be considered creative. Yeah?
Would you say then that the understanding, like this understanding of creativity isn't correct? Because a lot of people generally think like the understanding of creativity has to do with like cultural information and like meta information about the world around us. And if you do something which is perceived to be against the traditional pattern of doing things, it's perceived to be creative. Whereas that may not be the case in terms of what you've described. For instance, like when AlphaGo beat the Go champ, he described the AI's play as very creative.
Yeah.
But like you wouldn't really think of it in terms of the definition of creative.
Right. Yeah, I suppose there are multiple ways. So mine's maybe not creative.
That's like 2-year-olds.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if doing random things is considered creative.
Right. So sometimes they are like curiosity or these perfectly random things. But yeah, there's definitely aspects where there would be noise in the system. They do something that's random that could be considered creative. Happens to work out. If it doesn't work out, then you probably don't care about it. Or if it's like, that was an idiot, why did you do that? But if it did work out, then it's like, oh, so creative. I don't know. So related is imagination, so that's planning but not actually doing anything. But AI can work on there. And then curiosity, that's related to creativity as well. So exploitation versus exploration. So how much of the environment do I explore versus how much of what I know do I try and optimize. And that's the trade-off. So there's a whole bunch of research into this as well. One-shot learning, another thing AI is not too good at yet. But there are definite examples where it is. There's a big saying that like deep learning requires large amounts of data. Okay? And that can be true, but it's not always true. There are examples where sometimes it's not the best approach to do a deep learning algorithm. You rather use a simple one. In fact, there was a little debate between people who were saying like, no, you can just use a support vector machine, and this guy used deep learning machine. And he was like, you know what? I'm just going to use the same deep learning machine, cut it down, use less data, and it actually performs this as well as support vector machine. So it depends on the situation as well. Yeah.
A question like curiosity,
Mm-hmm.
AI curiosity. Are there ways to limit AI's curiosity? If so, do you think doing so would be a good or a bad?
There are different ways to limit curiosity. I think the bad thing would be if it had zero curiosity. You've seen quite a few algorithms, they will always have a randomizer. They're all important. But it shouldn't be zero. Whether it's a good or bad thing, I think would depend on the car and how you don't want a self-driving car to be like, oh, I wonder what happens if I turn right while I'm driving on the straight road, right? So I think it would depend on the car. But I'm happy to hear what other people think. Right? Don't want to spend too much time. Okay, understanding intelligence. I've kind of said we are naturally founded in AIs. But how do we actually understand intelligence? Because even though AI can be unbounded, how do we know when we reached it, or how do we actually improve upon it? Because you can try a lot of things, but the search space for AI algorithms is massive. It would take a long time to do it, so how would you find the best one in a short amount of time? So this is a little bit about understanding intelligence, and I'm a little bit biased here because I say it requires neuroscience. But it was also done by the CEO of Google's DeepMind. Only by better understanding human intelligence can we hope to push the boundaries of what artificial intellects can do. So he published a paper with a few other authors paper, Neuroscience-Inspired Artificial Intelligence, and to talk a little bit, oh, by the way, it's a real picture of two neurons. And there's a little bit of edits with the gray, but otherwise it's real. So this is what we do in our lab. So neuroscience-inspired AI. So I think that neuroscience is one of the ways that we can find good AI. An example is deep learning and reinforcement learning. Those are neuroscience-inspired AI applications from many years ago. Presently, good uses of neuroscience-inspired AI would be attention. So we have a good attention-based network or task. Yeah, it's anyone work with the CNN? You know what CNN stands for? Okay. Yeah, convolutional neural network. Normally takes an entire image, and what it can do is it can label it. Let's just say that. But very simple. Take an image, label it. But what attention can do is it searches over subsets of that image space, and then it also orientates where to search next as well. So if it looks in the middle and it sees a cat space, it's not going to then look in the top left corner because it doesn't actually expect anything to be there. It will search slightly to the right of it where it expects like a body and a tail, for example. And then you can start labeling things based on what's in the structure and uses attention. And that was inspired by neuroscience. Episodic memory, I mentioned that very briefly as well, with working memory, and how recent events can influence your decisions. Yeah. Answer is a number of ways. There's more than one approach. Probably the most commonly known one would be like an LSTM. So long short-term memory, which makes sense because it's like surely it's one or the other. But it uses both, and it has the long-term memory aspect of it has a little decay. So over time, what you learned a long time ago is less relevant now. And what you learn now is more relevant for what's next, right? So that is a time component, and it's based on the number of like events or iterations, but time, since it encounters that. Does that make sense? So that's just one approach. They do have other approaches as well. Yeah, choosing what's relevant at what point in time, we don't even know how the brain does that. So trying to decide how to make AI do it, we kind of projecting this is the algorithm you should use, and then hopefully the brain does something similar and try and match it up. Okay, in the future, hopefully AI can do intuitive understanding of the physical world, which is apparently one of the criticisms that it has now. People often say it doesn't understand who I am, doesn't understand that I have friends, doesn't understand who my friends are, and it's only because AI hasn't actually been trained on this. Because they have shown that if you give it like bouncing balls, right, it will learn there's gravity in that system. It will learn that if you throw them against each other, they bounce. So it actually starts to like automatically do this in a physical environment that we would consider natural. Okay, transfer learning, something Luke mentioned earlier. Train on one task is irrelevant to another task. Really cool. It's called zero-shot inferences. If you train it on one task, it makes it really good at similar tasks, even though it's never encountered before. Whereas other ones like start from 0 or less than 0, actually. Okay, imagination and planning, mentioned that very briefly, and then virtual brain analytics. That's understanding how the neural network is working. Virtual brain analytics is also a field known as AI neuroscience, so trying to understand AI using neuroscience-based techniques, inspired techniques. Okay, so where's intelligence going? AI, biology, hardware E, software, hardware, software, and then here are some examples of what they have. So neuromorphic engineering, mentioned that before, where we're going with this is we should have more data, more computation, but hardware is just one aspect. That's kind of our computer science approach at the moment. Let's just throw more computing power at it. But as Neil will attest to, if you optimize the algorithm or the software as well, an advancement in hardware is like what? Power, it's like squared. It's like software side of things, combining different types of AI, symbolic AI and statistical AI. Does anyone know the difference between the two? Yeah. No hands? No? No, keep it down. Okay. Very generally, symbolic AI is like classical AI, where it's a lot of logic, reasoning, planning, but it's quite bad at learning on the fly. So a new task. Whereas statistical AI is what's new, or it's like what's current at the moment, and that's like neural networks, for example. And that's really good at finding patterns, but it's not always great for logic. Okay, so trying to combine those two, and there's been recent success with that. Really cool stuff going ahead with there. And then also trying to get to a state of artificial and general intelligence in terms of biology, how to improve intelligence for biology hardware, nootropics, so that's brain enhancing drugs, for example. Also mentioned there lifelong learning. We're living longer. Our brains, we only be able to learn more just by living longer. Hopefully we don't forget it all by the time we get Alzheimer's. And then software, study over time, people are developing better heuristics of how to learn. Because ultimately we want to learn how to learn in the most optimal fashion. And understanding that is also one of the important aspects of like the software of how we think or how intelligence can improve, really from biology software perspective. Really interestingly, obviously, Elon Musk's recent venture, Neuralink, he wants to do something called like augmented intelligence, where you have a chip in your brain that has like some sort of AI that can actually improve you thinking by directly interfacing with your brain. Probably many years away. He's a very, very, very team of people to do the pretty surgical work, to do the AI work. I don't think it's going to have recent success, but it's a really cool idea. And if it does work, that would be one way for biology to go beyond what the current limits of it are by augmenting artificial intelligence as well. Okay. Limits of understanding intelligence, I mentioned AI neuroscience, black box algorithms. Interestingly, there's something called LIME. LIME stands for local interpretable, model agnostic explanations, which doesn't care how you actually make. What does it takes part of the image and reads output and then takes out and then determines what aspects of the image are important in making it. That could be one approach in order to somehow hold AI accountable or give like a reasoning base to why it made a certain decision. But that's super new. And then this is a visualization on the right of a neural network, and this is publicly available online. It's really, really cool to play around with. Quite basic, really cool to play around. Similar, neuroscience is also kind of a black box algorithm, because that's what our brain don't really understand how it works. We understand a lot of aspects of it. We have a lot of data about it. Understanding the algorithms that actually drive it is another thing altogether. So saying AI neuroscience is a black box algorithm is kind of like, well, we don't even know how we think or how I made a decision. So trying to say that AI should kind of holding it to a higher standard, maybe. Perhaps. I don't know. Something to talk about. Okay. How can we understand intelligence? Last two slides. Mars levels of analysis are those three classical ones. Bottom, implementation, algorithmic, computational development, and evolution on the top one. Application. So the brain is a very good implementation of a problem-solving tool. Algorithm is some sort of abstract solution. And then computational is like, how do we solve a problem? So it goes to different levels. And then learning the problem, and then meta, learning how to learn. Right? We're going to discuss this more afterwards. And then finally, a lot of people talk about all the things AI will take away from people. There will be instances where it can enhance. I found out an article where it said this is the job that will create. There are interesting ones. Sorry if you can't read it perfectly. Trainers, explainers, and sustainers. The people who train algorithms. People who explain that algorithms to like a business executive. And then people who make sure the right algorithms are doing the right thing. And being like, that algorithm's not doing too well, throw it away, use it less often. And things like that. So there'll be these interesting jobs that are going to come through. Okay, so that's like my very brief talk. Well, should have been briefer. Very brief talk about limits of technological intelligence. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks again to the sponsors Picking and Q. Thanks to my supervisors, Joe there on the right, UCT. Spent some time at Oxford with some Burgles. I work at Udacity and Fast AI. Making neural nets uncool again. Thanks. Cool. Yeah, so should we discuss for? Yeah, I mean, okay, so questions should not be purely directed at me. Please have I mean, the good thing. I think that's bad for the question first.
Where's AI going?
Absolutely.
Biology versus.
Yeah.
So I think, I sort of disagree with David's arguments and I think what's often overlooked in these discussions is collective intelligence. If you look at, especially like the first definition of saying, like, here's an agent interacting on a system. I mean, let's take a task like sending something to the moon, right? I mean, that's solved by a system of NASA, or let's say it's solve the task of how do we make all the world and I think if you're only looking at AI models of intelligence, I think you're actually ignoring what are the most intelligent systems on the planet at the moment, which are organizations and are even like economies as a whole. So in you have the decentralization debate between the Russians and the Americans in economics in the 40s, 30s and 40s. The Russian plans were like, well, do you organize how many tomato crates in New York City every day? And they're saying like no single person does that. It's a job that the market solves sort of amazingly well every day. So I think there's a huge amount of I'd argue the most intelligent system that on the planet at the moment are those type of systems actually, of which humans are just a small part.
Yeah, I do agree with you. I did admit that. That was one of my purposeful missions. Yeah, it worked. Yes, absolutely.
And I think we can see how there's sort of hierarchies of systems play a role and how to organize those. It's probably even the brain has as well. It's got these different areas of specialized systems.
Yeah.
So I think we can learn lessons from there as well, not just from biology inspired.
Yeah, cultural inspired AI. Sounds good. Sorry, you had a...
I forgot my question. But, in response to that, there is actually some work on how different AI models can interact. So one of the often
Yeah, Nick.
I just wanted to provide an example of two different AIs working together. It's a fairly recent development called GAN, Generative Adversarial Network. Essentially, you have one network which is a generator and another which is a discriminator. And the generator making it from the stick figure, or is it a real picture of a person? And they compete against each other and train each other to get better and better until you can actually make almost photorealistic images from drawings of stick figures. It's an interesting example of AI, different types of AI.
Yeah. To talk to Bias's point as well, was like many people acting together or differently in order to do some sort of big sort of cultural intelligence. I know that a lot of Google papers, you'll see something looks like a neural network, and then in the figure legend it will be like each one of these nodes is a neural network, and it's like, oh my goodness, that's massive. So they have networks and networks. Not saying that they have nearly the complexity of an equivalent cultural system. But I think people are aware that you can't have one network. If you want something to be quite general, you need a number of networks working together. Yeah.
When I was wondering what the implications are for that limits of intelligence slide you had, and the difference of biological systems, because I think you see it. I mean, there's some sort of trade-off with the energy in the biological configuration, but clearly humans working together can solve more complex tasks.
Yeah.
But I was sort of kind of thinking, like, if you did the calculation, like, you can't send a rocket to the moon if you just think of it in a one-stage rocket. It requires a limit within the way to get around it. It's two-stage rockets, we become propeller to weights.
Yeah, I agree with you. Even more to that, sending a man to the moon, you can't just send him there, you have to bring him back as well, right? So you should bring him back. Okay, cool. Do you want to, shall we move on to David? David? Comes through. Sorry, hold on to the images.
Another drink.
Yeah. Does anyone need a drink? Yeah, get a drink. Convene in 2 minutes.
Okay, let's load up the...
Just scroll through.
Just scroll through it, is it still... You have like millions, there we go, there's me.
They can hear us as well.
Yeah, being like, oh, what about this presentation? Yeah. So, do you read the statement? I didn't say only, because your quote says only. And I'm like, that's definitely, or at least I think the possibility of those like the genetic algorithms that they have, like just doing their own thing, it's really possible. So I think one chance of things are interesting eventually.
Yeah, so I think one of the main
I didn't realize I had to be very quick. Yeah. I don't know if I'll get through my
I guess in the way I don't think this contact is clear, but some people have like
No, I know, I need to go at the end, but if there's no time, I'll be like, nah, it's just I'm sorry. Questions off if it's necessary.
I think I'll answer all the questions with my ego.
By the end, you will have
No one will ask any questions. You'll regulate away all the problems.
Why is it so difficult?
You know, morality really doesn't matter because the law solves everything. I know this is like a slightly distinct problem to like noticing. You're like making a morally perfect AI might not be a legal like consideration. Like some AI.
What about this like perfect AI philosophy?
Yeah, well, I mean that's something actually interesting. I think there's a possibility of AI.
What if an AI is more moral than us?
Relevant theory.
It's kind of like the God question. So, you know, like, is God perfectly moral because he's God, or because he has a perfect understanding of the same moral frameworks that we judge ourselves on? So we could create the good kind of God with AI. It's like a perfect understanding.
No, I want to make one that has my into it.
I want to be particular. Yeah, I suppose I don't want the self-driving car to like be the monopoly of stop me to go and get drunk. Like, so I don't want them to be too moral.
You're clearly not a proponent of the veil of ignorance.
Yeah. when it's relative, as it applies to other people.
I'm skeptical about how much you do care about it. That's like the very much like the least onus on yourself to make people money. It's a pretty
big problem in our lives.
That was somewhat inconsistent with being moral. I feel like moral is kind of like
There's a story on Facebook of Dan picking a fight with 18-year-olds.
Anyway, you should probably start because otherwise Neil won't get to do it all. Otherwise Neil won't get to do it all.
That's if you know you're the lost
My ideal government would be a philosopher came into AI. Isn't that dope?
Yeah. I don't think I'm going to support that. Well, I actually like the human AI collaborative.
Well, there are definitely things that AI should do in government.
Cool. Thank you, everyone. We're going to start now with David.
Okay. Hello everyone. Sorry to interrupt you all. Yeah, I think we're gonna get started. Some people are still discussing in the background. Okay. So, okay. The chance of Neil getting to give a talk is getting less and less. So, my name's David. I'm a master's student in the philosophy department at UCT, but I also have a BSc background. I did computer science and computer game development as an undergraduate, and so this talk is an amalgamation of many of my interests. I'm going to talk about the question of whether machines and AI can be moral, and I'm going to weigh in on the speculative debate about whether, as machine intelligence increases, they are likely to be moral or moral in a way that we deem acceptable as human beings. So AI raises a lot of very fascinating questions for philosophy, They've been going back even before AI remotely existed, before computers existed. People were interested in whether non-human entities can be intelligences. Leibniz, who's famous for co-inventing calculus, spoke about the possibility of a mill and whether a mind could be an entity like that. So we've asked questions like, can a machine have a mind? That's no longer that fashionable. Most people believe that it is possible. How do we decide if a machine has a mind? Asking whether things like the Turing test are good measures of intelligence. We can ask questions about whether machines can be moral agents, which I'll touch on in this talk. And there's a bunch of others. I'm mostly interested in questions like, how do we ethically design AI systems? And I'm going to talk about artificial general intelligence and strong AI and whether those sorts of machines are likely to have morals. So I think a lot of this is very speculative. So take what I say with some degree of salt. And I think what I do want to say is that a lot of the extreme opinions in the media that we should be very frightened about the development of AI, I think are misplaced. But I also think radically optimistic views that say that we shouldn't be concerned about the moral development of AI are also misplaced. So a few useful definitions. The first is artificial general intelligence. Chris spoke about that already, but it's a machine that could be said to be capable of accomplishing any intellectual task that a human can. And Goetzel says it's a machine that needs efficient cross-domain optimization, which I might consider to be a reasonable definition of creativity. It's where you've got lots of different aspects of information, different domains that you're considering. I might know about philosophy, and now I might know about computer science, and mixing those together and giving you this talk is an example of cross-domain optimization. And a machine that could be said to do that as well as humans and as applied to human intellectual tasks can be said to be artificial general intelligence. That's contrasted with artificial narrow intelligence, which is a machine that is designed to learn to efficiently solve a specific task. This is something like Deep Blue learning to play chess well. I'm going to do questions at the end because I'm very worried about time. So there's a spectrum here, and that's something I think is very important to get across, is that some artificial intelligences get closer to that end goal of artificial general intelligence, and some are very narrow. And things like self-driving cars are somewhere along that spectrum. And if we imagine in the distant future an artificial intelligence doing philosophy, that would be a lot closer to what we might consider artificial general intelligence. Another term is strong artificial intelligence, and I just want to distinguish that from artificial general intelligence now, because some people think that they're not equivalent, other people do. So this is a machine or an artificial intelligence that could be said to have a mind and could be considered a non-human person. So that means an agent that's responsible and something that we would consider worthy of moral consideration. So some people think that artificial general intelligence, should it be achieved, would automatically count as strong AI. I personally believe that to be true, but other people think it's possible that you might merely be replicating or giving the illusion of intelligence without actually necessarily possessing that. I think one key feature of strong AI that I am going to talk about is that it would be an agent. It would be capable of self-reflection and revision, and setting its own goals and acting on its own goals. And that, I think, has special moral significance, which I'll talk about later. So a difficult question is, what would it mean for AI to be ethical? And to completely answer that question, I would need to solve ethics. I would need to be able to give you an answer to what would it mean for a human to be completely ethical, which unfortunately I can't. So I need to work with some provisional definitions and some vague definitions, but ones that I think are still informative. And so there are two types of moral judgment that we can make. There's other sort of more specific types of moral judgment, But broadly, I like to categorize those as judging actions. So, for example, if I decide to lie to Neil, we can judge that action as being one that we consider good or bad. And I think this type of moral judgment applies to any machine that's capable of making decisions autonomously, where it would be presented with options and the machine would be responsible for selecting one of those options or more of those options, independent of a human controlling it. And any machine capable of that, I think we can judge the actions of. And where we place responsibility for that, I think raises some other interesting problems that I'm not going to talk about, but Neil, I think, might touch on. So secondly, we might judge the justification for acting in a particular way, or the intention for acting in a particular way. So while I may have lied to Neil and that might be considered a bad action, I might have done so for good reasons. I might have wanted to protect him. And so we can judge those justifications morally as well. And this, I think, applies only to AI that could be said to think like humans and could be said to be agents. So I think this sort of judgment would only apply to AI along the spectrum closer towards being artificial general intelligence and closer to being strong AI or machines that can be said to have minds. So another interesting question is, how do we know if an AI is ethical? So if I am presented with an algorithm or presented with some intelligent system, how do I judge whether it has been acting morally or not, and how do I judge whether its justifications are good or not? So one approach is that we should compare the AI's decisions to that a human would make. So we give an AI a bunch of scenarios. You can imagine a sort of moral Turing test. And then we ask that AI to tell us what the right thing to do is. And we compare that to what humans do, and then see if a judge would be able to discern them. That's one proposed way of evaluating whether AI could be said to be moral. I think that's somewhat limited, so I think it's a good approach for getting AI that we would consider minimally moral, but I don't think it's a good approach for getting AI that we might consider morally excellent. Maybe AI could have moral values that we deem exceptional and better than humans. So I think that account is not perfect, but it is something that we could use. The second thing we could do is we could create AI that are capable of expressing their justifications. And here I think developing systems and how to ethically develop intelligent systems is something that needs to be cognizant of this. For example, if we're developing a system that needs to assess whether someone is likely to have committed a crime or not, I think it's very important, if we're to judge that kind of system as being good or bad, that it can offer us some sort of rationale. And popular examples are things like AIs that have resorted to racial profiling, but because they're implemented as black boxes that can't explain the way that the neural network picks between different people, we might not be able to identify that the way that that AI acts is something we would conventionally consider immoral. So transparency is very important, and I think this is one approach where perhaps moral consultants and people who are employed at companies like Google can be involved in the continuing development of ethical AI. And the third thing, which I think is more relevant to AI far on the intelligence spectrum, this is something we're going to actually need to be worried about in 40 years. And some people have given more conservative predictions that Chris has listed. But in some circumstances, we might need to defer to the AI in questions about ethics. So if we believe that a machine is more capable of synthesizing large bodies of information, is more familiar with contemporary works on moral philosophy, has considered more cases than any human, I think it's quite plausible in some circumstances that we should defer to that being's moral judgments instead of our own moral judgments. But I'll talk somewhat about that later. And I think one consideration is that practically, when we're interested in questions around AI and morality, what we're actually most interested in is whether AI goals are going to be aligned with human preferences, more than we're concerned with whether AI is actually going to be moral in the deep philosophical sense. So let's move on to a practical question of how do we design ethical AI, and I think this features in questions about regulation. So I think this needs to be taken very seriously, and so I agree with Elon Musk in the sense that I think we do need to take these questions seriously, and we might need legislative intervention to ensure that they are taken sufficiently seriously. I think amoral artificial intelligence, or artificial intelligence that doesn't make moral judgments and yet is in a position in which we might expect humans to make those kinds of moral judgments, is particularly dangerous. So here's the example of the AI called Compass, which resorted to racial profiling in the United States. And I think if you have AI that are, for example, in conflict situations, and they're faced with decisions that humans would have to make that are moral, but they don't have any programming that's relevant to making moral judgments, I think that might be extremely dangerous. So where we give AI goals like eliminating terrorism, and those AI are very powerful in the tools they have available to them, I think an amoral AI, or an AI that's not cognizant of ethics, is the most dangerous of all, as opposed to one that is making ethical deliberations. So I think obviously immoral AI, or AI that are designed to pursue nefarious goals, are obviously very frightening as well, and regulators should be concerned with that possibility. And finally, I also think that transparency in the way that we design ethical systems is very important, so that we can make these evaluations, because the development of AI is a process. And if things start going wrong along that process, I would hope that we're able to notice that and make revisions to how we engage with this sort of questioning. So in terms of getting down to more practically how we might design ethical AI, these are three broad categories of approach that people have been talking about. This is quite consistent among philosophers and computer scientists and engineers. So we can think about top-down approaches, which is where humans come up with moral rules. That's great because it might offer a job to philosophers like myself. And you might think of examples like the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Utilitarianism, we should promote the greatest welfare for the greatest number. Asimov's laws of robotics. And these are then built into the AI and hard-coded such that it should never violate these ethical rules under any circumstances. That's one approach. It might also be that we get humans to look at a whole range of moral situations that an AI might be involved in, and then evaluate what the AI should do. Then we might have bottom-up approaches, which I think are more interesting, and I think in the long run more promising as well, which is where AI learn moral rules from data. They go through huge volumes of data, and from that they learn trends in how to act. More sophisticated bottom-up approaches that might be possible in the future are AI actually reading through moral justifications and looking at different moral arguments and evaluating them. Though that's not actual at the moment, there are actual bottom-up approaches of AI learning moral norms from stories, for instance. And hybrid approaches combine elements of these two. And I think that's really where we want to end up in the long run for AI that's incredibly intelligent. The way humans work is we start with top-down approaches. Parents tell us what to do. We've got kind of top-down morality, like we follow the law, and that's what informs our moral values. And as we get older, as we become more educated, we start to engage in bottom-up moral reasoning, where we investigate situations, we compare that with our theories, and we engage in a process of what philosophers commonly call reflective equilibrium, where I might make observations and thereby revise my theory, or I might use my theory to decide what to do in future. Sometimes my intuitions disagree with my moral theories and I revise my intuitions about particular actions. Other times I revise my theories. And that's what a hybrid approach ideally would try to do for artificial intelligence. So let's ask the philosophical question. Are these approaches good? Is a top-down approach good? I think it is for AI that we could consider further along the narrow side of the spectrum. So I think if we can easily predict the sort of moral judgments that an AI will need to make, then I think we could build that into AI. The obvious problem is we need to evaluate whether humans are good enough at assessing whether we are good enough at making moral laws and prescribing moral laws. So I think a self-driving car, for example, we could have a top-down approach and I would consider that reasonable. We could say, for example, if you've got decisions about whether to, I guess, speed when your owner tells you to do so, we could write that sort of thing into a self-driving car. We could observe moral cases that self-driving cars have been involved in. We can get complaints and we can engage in a top-down approach for that. However, I think in certain other circumstances where we're less capable of foreseeing what might happen, for example, if we're deciding how to teach an AI to be moral in a war situation, I think that there it's a lot more difficult for us to prescribe clear, unambiguous, and non-contradictory moral rules. So in certain circumstances, we might say something like, preserve human life, but that rule is going to end up being contradictory in a number of circumstances, and then it's unclear what an AI might do if we've taken a top-down approach. I think also top-down approaches might limit moral progress. So in some circumstances, I think humans might not be best suited to making moral evaluations. We can't look through a broad enough spectrum of cases. And I think for very intelligent systems that are capable of accessing a far broader range of instances than we are, usually the way we make moral judgments comes largely from experience, but also theorizing. And I think an AI that might have the capacity to do those to a greater extent than humans is a promising prospect, something that I would look forward to. And so I don't think top-down ethical designs are always good. So what about bottom-up approaches? Well, I think some of the virtues are that they might resemble more appropriately how humans make moral judgments. We often decide on a gut feel. We often struggle to articulate our moral judgments overtly. We might be faced with situations that go against our previously held moral theories. So someone might think, for example, that we should always maximize the greatest happiness for the greatest number, but then I ask them, do you think it's okay for someone to steal my car if they could use it better than me? And then lots of people will answer, no, it's not okay for them to do that, even though it creates more happiness. So often we need to make moral judgments by encountering cases, and then we've got a sort of underlying moral theory that we're relying on that we can't overtly articulate. So I think a bottom-up approach better allows a machine to do that. And so in very complex situations, I think this is necessary, and I'll talk a bit later about why I think it can be a good one. Some of the risks, though, is that we need to be very careful about the data set that these AI learn from. So some, I guess, examples of this that have been done are cases like good AI, which deals with a machine trying to form moral judgments based on the way humans judge certain situations. There's other developments where they've got AI to look through stories and then evaluate appropriate rules for action based on those stories. The one unintended result from that, while it's, I guess, arguably somewhat benign, is that the AI thought that on a date it was morally required that you would kiss. Because of the set of stories that it was exposed to. So that needs to be carefully curated. I think, pointing to examples like Tay from Microsoft is maybe a bad way of evaluating bottom-up approaches to machines learning ethics, because there you've got a very biased data set. It's not curated at all, but the results from instances of curated data sets teaching machines moral values have been fairly positive so far, and I think they can only get better. For a very sophisticated AI, one that I think we could classify as a mind, I think using a more open data set is fair. I think letting the AI out into the wilderness, so to speak, to troll the internet for whatever it wants, I think is a good approach for an AI that could be deemed as intelligent as a human. Okay, so now let's ask the sort of fun, more science fiction kind of philosophy about artificial intelligence that gets to be very intelligent, and we might speculate about whether self-reflecting and revising machines are likely to come up with good moral values, and should we be scared of the intellectual progress in artificial intelligence. So this is all highly speculative, and I think one important thing to take into consideration is that we can watch this unfolding to some extent, and we can adjust our theories as the development of AI occurs. So I think some of these worries will apply to weak AI as well. And I think there are a lot of risks associated with how humans teach AI to be moral. And I think, if anything, I'm more scared of AI that's dependent on humans to teach it moral values than I am scared on AI that could be said to be intelligent and learn those for itself. Okay, so here's some reasons why we might be worried about intelligent machines forming bad moral values or being what we could consider evil. So they might learn from bad sources. Second is they might not empathize with humans, or they lack human emotions. Third, they might be corrupted by being very powerful relative to humans. And finally, they might form extreme but defensible or consistent moral beliefs, which I take to be the most serious of those. So as far as AI learning from bad sources or bad data, it's possible that AI might pick the wrong humans to learn from. It's possible that it might be designed by humans that don't have particularly good moral values. It could be a result of manipulation as well, so if someone interferes with the development of AI that could be said to be very intelligent. And these are some sort of worries that we might have about AI learning to be moral. So I think if we are talking about strong AI and a truly autonomous intelligent machine, then I think it should be able to access better sources and be able to recognize them as such. So generally we consider humans that are intelligent to be capable of doing so. And I think if you look at the set of human beings that have been interested in investigating morality and investigating what moral values they ought to hold, generally being more intelligent means you're more likely to be able to access good sources and form positive beliefs. So I'm optimistic that a more intelligent artificial intelligence is less at risk of this problem than one that's less intelligent. And I think regulation and transparent practices can help ensure that this is the case, that we don't have limited data sets that AI are learning from, and that we know what data sets AI are learning from when it comes to moral values. So this is just a brief overview of these arguments. There's a huge amount more depth. I could talk about any of these for the full length of the talk. So here's one that people, I think, is very interesting. It's generally the idea that AI won't empathize with humans, or they lack certain emotional resources that humans have, or certain human feelings that makes them incapable of being moral, or at least being moral in the same way as humans are. So here's the basic argument, which is that ethical treatment of X depends on empathizing with X, or having shared relevant features. So that might be something like human ethical treatment of animals depends on us empathizing with animals. The second premise is that AI will not empathize with humans, presumably because they don't share enough relevant similar features. And the conclusion is that AI will not treat humans ethically. So some support for the first premise is that empathy, at least on the face of it, seems very important to human moral behavior. The fact that I might, on seeing someone else suffering, feel bad means that I'm more likely to do something about their suffering or less likely to cause that suffering to begin with. And it might explain things like the fact that we tend not to care nearly as much about animals as we do about other humans. And with regard to animals, we care more about animals that have more mammalian features than we do about animals like fish. So support for premise 2 is that machines lack human subjective experience. So could we design a machine to feel pain? It wouldn't have C fibers firing in the same way that humans do. AI might not feel pleasure in the same way that we do. It might not be driven by a cultural history that we share with other humans. And what I think in response to this argument is I'd like to respond to both of those premises. I think my response to the second one is probably better. But in terms of empathy, I think empathy might, in some circumstances, be a barrier to good moral behavior. So Moyo gives the example where people were asked to give food aid to Afghanistan, and what happened as a result was that aid ended up empowering the Taliban to further oppress those people. So in some circumstances, empathy might not be a good guide to acting morally, and we might need to be more impartial. I think also in some circumstances, empathy leads humans to care more about humans that are similar to them, and that sort of moral bias is a problem that ideally we would be able to overcome. Strong human emotions, also things like my strong desire for pleasure might outweigh other morally relevant emotions, feelings like guilt. I might want to lie to someone because it benefits me in future, and that might outweigh my moral emotions around guilt. And I think in terms of the second response, I think that it's certainly in terms of thinking about what the relevant features of human mental states are that makes us moral and makes us behave the way we do, I think they're functional, not qualitative. What I mean by that is it's not the subjective feel of pain that matters, it's the role that pain plays within the human brain and within the human organism. It's the functional specifications that it has. And so I think AI can be designed that shares many of these features. And in fact, this has been tried when developing autonomous fighting machines and machines that engage in conflict situations. One approach to making them engage in that morally is to build in functions like guilt and remorse. And that's been shown to have quite good success relative to overtly writing in those kinds of moral behaviors. So in terms of this, I think the most important thing relevant to assessing someone else as being worthy of moral consideration is the recognition that they are sentient and sapient. So when we talk about sentience, it's the capacity to feel, and sapience is the capacity to be self-aware and reflective. And I think being sapient, like an extremely intelligent machine, will mean that we share at least one important similar feature on which it's likely to base moral judgments. In the same way that I think we tend to have progressed as a society towards caring for a broader range of people based on these shared features. In early human history, the moral theories that they had tended not to be very considerate of people from different cultural or racial groups, and we've progressed a lot in that sense, and a lot of the developments in ethics in the last 50 to 100 years have been including animals to a greater extent in our ethical calculations because they share the capacity for sentience. So I think it's likely that an AI that is genuinely intelligent would also engage with the world in this sort of way. So the third argument is that AI might be corrupted by being very powerful, so this is based on the idea that humans behave morally because we are under threat from other people behaving immorally. So we have a stake in moral laws because they protect us. I behave morally because I don't want Neil to punch me. And in this case, AI has the capacity to be vastly more powerful than humans, being able to replicate itself. And this largely applies to strong AI or AI that's self-reflective and sets its own goals. I think that in this situation where, part of being a mind is that you have the capacity for revision. And so thinking that we could just control very intelligent machines or machines that are more intelligent than us, I think is somewhat naive. And this idea is that when machines become very much more intelligent than us, they won't feel any need to form moral values that take us into account. So in response to this, I think it's unclear that necessarily AI interests will diverge that far from humans, even if they stop being interested in us from a moral perspective. They might still be interested in us from an intellectual perspective. I think they might feel some loyalty to us as their creators, much in the same way that humans feel some sense of loyalty to our parents, our ancestors, cultures that we've had that came before. I think additionally, one important thing to note is that when AI develops, they need to start from somewhere. If you're familiar with Bayesian statistics, you might be familiar with the problem of choosing your prior probabilities. And so I think the idea that an AI will diverge vastly from the sorts of values that humans have decided on is somewhat unlikely, much in the same way that if you said, I have a pill that removes your moral inhibitions about murdering, I'm not going to have any interest in taking that pill because I already have the moral judgments that I ought not murder. And so I think AI, as it becomes more powerful, is still likely to carry some of the ethical baggage that it formed while it was less powerful than that. And so in that sense, I think there's reasons to believe that it wouldn't form these kinds of judgments. Equally, moral philosophers and have generally gone against the idea that we have moral theories just because other people are a threat to us. And if you look at very powerful people, it's not clear that they always have worse moral values than anyone else. So in terms of the final argument, this is one that I also think is quite exciting, is that the AI might form extreme but consistent moral beliefs. So we can imagine, quite strange theories being possible for an intelligent machine. We can think of some professional moral philosophers who've had weird beliefs in the past. Extreme theories like utilitarianism, which says that we need to always maximize happiness, or other extreme theories that say we should never do anything that we could consider evil, like Immanuel Kant thinking that we shouldn't lie to murderers to stop them killing people. An AI might form a consistent moral view that we would consider to be extreme. So it might even believe that morality doesn't exist, and therefore not consider it a relevant form of intellectual inquiry or behavior determining mechanism. So what I'd say to this is you might get this picture from the most famous instances of philosophical theories that enter the public domain. I think what we often look at are extreme instances. People are very familiar with works of people like Nietzsche, who think that our moral values are just ways that the weak enslave the powerful, for example. People are familiar with some of the dominant moral theories, but not that familiar with contemporary moral philosophy and how it's developed. And I think in this line, we can see a clear trend towards more moderate moral views and more sophisticated moral views. For example, in the last 30 years, we've been describing in greater detail the conditions under which self-defense might be permissible, whereas often in the past it was just thought to be a given. We didn't have sophisticated views about that. So I think moral philosophy in general is getting closer to what we might take to be a common sense view and what we might consider a moderate view. I think also my second response is that if indeed the AI is very intelligent, then it could well be correct, and in fact is more likely to be correct about this than us. And so we might actually look forward to this kind of idea. I think if you imagine, for example, the ancient Greeks are deciding what sort of, let's say they can create a machine that's very intelligent, and they're interested in what moral values it might come to have. Well, if it progresses anything like human society did, then it would come to believe that slavery is wrong, and the ancient Greeks would have found that weird. And so I think the possibility of a very intelligent machine forming new and different moral values to us is not something to be scared of, but actually something to look forward to. And I think every trend in the way that intelligent humans have engaged with morality is that our moral views are considerate of more people, and our moral views are in some sense more caring than they have been in the past. But equally, we can look to the justifications that a very intelligent machine offers us, and that might also give us some insight and might help us be better. So, I've come to the end of my talk, and just to conclude, I think we should be concerned about questions of designing ethical artificial intelligence. They're interdisciplinary questions, they're questions being worked on by diverse teams of people, and I think we need to steer clear of very radical positions, very extreme views that say that AI is very likely to wipe us out, for example, I think are quite implausible. And I think when thinking about the science fiction side of things, or machines that have minds that will come about in the more distant future, I think actually machines that are more intelligent are in many ways less scary than machines that are less intelligent. Hannah Arendt talks about the banality of evil, that people in the Holocaust who were just following orders were in many ways the most frightening. And I think the same is true of AI, and an AI capable of making moral judgments, to me, is a hell of a lot less scary than an AI that's just been programmed with human values. But even that I would consider to be even less scary than an AI that has no values, no ethical values whatsoever. Cool. Are there any questions? I'm going to try and take like 5 minutes. Yeah, Chad.
I think the question might be a bit simplistic, but when you look at the morality of AI, with artificial intelligence, is it a legitimate concern that we might develop morally deceptive AI?
Oh yeah. So if we're testing it for being moral, it just lies to us and then goes and behaves immorally. Yeah, I think that is true, and that's one of the reasons why I think a moral Turing test is not the best test. To some degree, to know the true moral values of anyone, you need to look at their behavior, right? I think that means, obviously, there's huge risks because we need the AI to behave before we can judge it. But I think the right sort of way to see this is that we should treat any machine that is very intelligent as needing to be at least somewhat like how we would treat children, and offering them a good basis, and then giving them access progressively to more information. And I think importantly, with the way that we judge AI ethically, we can pool our collective knowledge, and we can see, this implementation of ethics in a self-driving car was worse than another, and we can come to have pretty good models of that and good ways of designing this in the long run, I think. But yeah, that is a problem that we would need to be worried about. But I think the point is, why would you design an AI that ends up in that situation to begin with? I think the bigger thing, like a child, is you'd want it to never be in that position to start with. Yeah?
So I just on the top-down versus the bottom-up approach. So with sort of historical, maybe precedent is how we try to encode moral behavior in legal code. It's sort of I don't know very much about legal, but my understanding is there's two approaches: the codex versus the case law approach, where the one being the top-down, you say well, what have we learned from that as to which one is more applicable in which situations?
Well, I think a lot of different places have different systems. I would say having a living body of law that develops over time is very important. So personally, I think having codified law is useful insofar as it's easy to predict what the law will be. However, it's dangerous insofar as if we're too religiously stick to those laws, they don't adapt quickly enough. And so I think a hybrid approach, if you can elegantly design it, is better. And in part, I think the law has a lot of limitations, and the law needs to be very distinct from morality, in part because of these limitations in designing it. And I think Neil might talk about this, is that the line between law and morality is blurred by the development of AI. And I think when it comes to morality, would ideally have a hybrid approach so that it can both be adaptive and be safe insofar as we can reliably expect it to do certain things. But it's a very tricky question. And in legal systems, I think one piece of advice that I would have is that they should consult philosophers more, which I would also advise to engineers trying to develop moral systems. Yeah?
Do you think that it's immoral to train a moral AI to follow contemporary human preferences in the same way that our contemporary preferences may objectively be not what's most moral?
Well, I think that's part of my argument for why I do think the bottom-up approaches are good. I think one important thing is that I don't think as a matter of legislation or as a matter of ethics, we need to design every AI to be morally excellent. I think there's a certain base level that we would need to meet, but not all AI need to be morally excellent. For example, I might not like a self-driving car that's morally excellent because it might refuse to let me drive to the pub instead of staying at home and working. I think in terms of the question of what our moral obligations are in terms of what standard of morality we have to design, we don't have obligations to always design AI to be morally excellent. I think designing them with human moral values is a safe approach that I think we should pursue initially while we're developing more sophisticated bottom-up methods. And then I think in the long run, I think bottom-up methods of designing moral intelligence are preferable for that exact reason. Yeah.
Thanks, Dave. On a similar note, very quickly as well, when someone creates an AI in order to purposely attack something, we can consider that immoral. And then if you design an AI to attack that one,
okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So now you also purposely designed one that's immoral in order to counteract another immoral one.
Well, I think that's a very complex question, and it depends a lot on the ethics of self-defense, right? So I don't think it's automatically wrong for an AI to be responsible for what you might consider attacking. I think conflict is necessary in a lot of circumstances, and the possibility of designing an AI to counteract that comes with its own considerations. I mean, is there a risk of them engaging in a conflict that escalates, leading to catastrophic damage to human society? But that's a similar question to how we ask questions about conflict all the time, about whether how we should use nuclear weapons, how we should use dangerous or weapons that cause more collateral damage than others. I think when we get to a point where we can have AI that learn moral rules and are engaged in these moral situations, I would much prefer that the AI faced with those orders be one that could say, maybe, why do I have to do this? I don't consider this a moral act. I would much prefer that than an AI that just thinks, I have to beat the other AI at all costs. Yeah?
So, personally, morality is pretty much subjective, right? 100 years ago, you couldn't say anything about being like individual because it wasn't a limb. So, our morals are constantly changing. They change between societies and even within a particular society, very much like, let's say, for example, cancer. You go from one group to the next, they've got different models. So she, whatever the programming, needs to actually have a background of what that particular, I don't know, but you get
I get the point.
Like, how does one deal with that problem?
Okay, so I think we should distinguish moral values from customs. So some things are, for example, like shaking hands or how I greet people is a matter of custom. There isn't, so it might be a good thing for me to follow the customs of the area, but there's nothing essentially moral about that. Whether I should shake hands to greet people or not is not essentially moral in nature.
Let's say, for example, you go into an island where, it's quite okay to go and hang your mates.
Yeah. So I think in terms of what most moral philosophers think about this, they definitely don't think morality is subjective. And the problem with that is just that we could never explain to someone that they shouldn't do something if morality were subjective. And I think for the most part we do have a lot of similarity in our moral judgments. They're not nearly as varied as people might claim. So things like not causing unnecessary suffering to others. If you actually look at societies in which they do these sorts of things, usually the rationale is that those people aren't worthy of moral consideration. They're not people. And that's why it's fine to treat them however you want. But once you've got the idea that someone is an equal person, usually our assessments of moral treatment are quite similar. We tend to have prohibitions against murder and extreme moral and torture and extreme moral ills, while some other things fall more in a grey area about whether it might be permissible to lie to someone or tell white lies, for instance. I think what is desirable is that an AI would certainly encapsulate our most extreme moral judgments, and then what it does about grey areas, I think, is less of a significant concern, but I think an AI that's capable of expressing the judgments and the reasons for its judgment would be better in those circumstances. I think appealing to the body of what we're doing as moral philosophers and the body of knowledge that's been built up around that is one good starting point. So I don't really want to get into the elaborate debate about whether ethics is relative. The answer is it is to some extent and in some circumstances, but usually not. And cashing out what that means is going to take too long. But yeah, I think one way of doing it is to appeal to experts in the subject, and being culturally sensitive is something that by and large is taken into account in the discipline. Yeah? I think we need to wrap up because Neil needs to talk as well.
Write to talk down. Write to question down.
Yeah.
Cool.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Dave, for giving me enough time to also do a talk. And thanks everyone for organizing. I think this is really rad. I've enjoyed the speeches so far. So I'm looking at the law and artificial intelligence. So now we've heard a lot about theory, so what are we going to do? Of course, there's the hype. Elon Musk seems to be perpetually worried about the fate of the human race. So he's raised some alarm bells. Bill Gates as well also getting in on that. Some people actually started on regulation for artificial intelligence. The Japanese document they've produced on what they're calling the fourth industrial revolution is actually quite interesting. If you know nothing about AI, go read that. It's a good introduction. It's a policy document that they wrote, but they're explaining what this thing is in like quite a lot of detail because the people reading it usually don't know. European Parliament has also been putting together some things to try and just get a list going of artificial intelligences of robots. Britain probably not going to be part of that. So people are doing things.
Can I just say, well, if you don't mind having
Yeah.
I know the European Union, so by 2018, maybe all we have regulation like where it comes from.
Yes.
And then another advocate for regulation is Bill Gates saying the reason AI should be regulated is because the rapid rate of that
Yes, so there's quite a lot of talk specifically around taxing people for building artificial intelligence in order to fund the job loss. I am hoping to discuss that in a bit more detail later if we get the chance. But yeah, it seems like what they're doing at the moment is just trying to say, whoa, there's a lot happening and we want to get some sight of some of it. So tell us what you're doing and we're going to get a list going so that at least we know. And then we'll see from there what we can do. So I am going through this quite fast, just kind of setting the scene, and then I want to get into the juicy stuff. But basically the point is AI is here, and people are now making moves. And the question is, what regulation are we actually going to use? And I want to take you through some of the considerations there. The thing that is driving it the most, so to speak, the thing that's kind of really... Chris, did you put on the wrong set of slides? I think you might have. Okay, that's fine. I'll just talk about it. Self-driving cars, right? They're pretty much here, and they're going to drastically change the rules of the road, which is a very highly regulated space, right? So, just put up your hand. Who does know about the trolley problem? About half of you. So oh no, it's fine, Chris. You're running my. I'll just talk to it. I think we put on the old set of slides, but anyway, it's fine. So the trolley problem applied to self-driving cars is basically where someone runs into the road, or let's say a group of 3 people run into the road, and there's one of you in the car. Now the car can either decide, is it going to kill the 3 people, or is it going to swerve off a cliff and kill you? Right, so it's been a problem in moral philosophy for a very long time. Dave will be able to tell you more about that. But now suddenly it's a case where we actually have to make a decision, yeah?
No, I was going to say, moral philosophy is different. It's not self-choosing. One person can do it, not yourself.
Yes.
That's this. It's do I kill myself?
Well, it's AI deciding, so it is deciding between you.
Well, there's.
Well, we're deciding whether the AI should decide.
The car manufacturer selling these AI cars is deciding if, a buyer or some other people are buying it.
You could just start the question that friends do, but if you have 3 friends coming back from another.
Yeah, so obviously we're trying to avoid the problem as much as possible, but when it does arrive, we need to now have an answer. But it is interesting, like, which agent are you considering, right? So obviously the person sitting in the car is not driving it, so the AI is making the decision. The person who builds the AI then plants that in. If you start talking about like really strong AIs that happen to be also self-driving cars, like then maybe the AI decides to protect itself and kill the people, right? So that could also be interesting. The other thing that someone at the back mentioned earlier was with traffic lights. They're like most of regulations on the road are for communicating to people. So the robot is red, it means there's cars coming past and we're telling you that. You don't need to communicate that to a car, just like wireless, right? So the cars just go like this. So, there's like a lot of regulation on the road that can drastically change and should drastically change speed limits, all of that. So I think that's really the big thing that's pushing to kind of set up why do we now need to start considering regulation. It's not a problem for the future for strong AI like it's happening now. So what's that regulation going to be? So the next slide, I hope not too many people saw the spoilers. Chris, what's going on? Okay, this slide says what's so concerning about AI. Hopefully that's not on your computer, Chris. Is he messing with me? But so before I jump in, this is a question I'd like you to just dwell on for like 5-10 seconds. Is like, what are you actually concerned about with AI? Like, is it that it's dangerous? Lots of things are dangerous, right? Is it that it's another mind that's not a human? Like, well, we have animals. There are also those things. So what is it about AI that's actually so particularly concerning? The one that I want to focus on, which is hopefully going to display, is there any potential solution to this? Can I plug my computer in?
Restart.
Yeah. Sorry about that, guys.
It's fine, yeah.
Contemplate the question so long. What do you find concerning about it? Is it going? Okay. Okay. Oh, fine.
No, okay. Yeah.
No one here like good at technology.
No. It was on extent. Looks fun for all the other ones.
Yeah, change it to duplicate display.
Wow. Really
Okay, let's see if it changes. Okay, so that was the slide you missed about the self-driving car. It's them going through each other. Okay, there's the trolley problem. So, okay, there was one other thing I wanted to talk about the trolley problem because Dave kind of led me into that, which is where does law fit into moral questions? Generally, the courts are not particularly in the business of deciding what's a better policy. They don't say this is what you should do. They have a spectrum of things which are legal and a spectrum of things which are not legal, and they tell you which box you fall in. That's what courts like to do. So if you imagine this problem, there's a number of things that could pop up that would be particularly difficult to deal with, right? So first of all, if Parliament sets a law and says in those situations you have to kill fewer people, and then someone challenges that legislation in court for being unconstitutional, and they rely on the right to life, court's got to make a decision there, right? If someone starts designing a car that's going to kill more people, and someone tries to interdict them and says what you're going to do is potentially going to violate rights, then the court's got to get involved there, right? If no law is passed and a car kills someone and they sue, then the court's got to decide was there negligence involved in that. So there's a lot of situations where the courts might be forced into grappling with this question. I put Stewart versus Buerta there. That was a wrongful life, well, it was wrongful birth, or one of the two, I get confused. But basically, parents didn't want a kid. Kid was born and had defects and cost a lot of money, and they sued. And the courts, they didn't want to get involved in that case. They were, we don't want to decide whether it would have been better to have never been born. Constitutional Court has since backtracked on that a little bit, and they've said, no. Constitution has to be everywhere, so we do have to consider all questions. But these are the sorts of things that very often the courts don't want to be involved with. They don't want to be making those decisions. I had Currin up earlier, which was where the court said, look, it's the legislature's job to decide this. You get together and you form your regulations, and then we'll just decide whether or not it's legal. They don't want to actually be setting the policy. Okay, so what's so concerning about AI? Hopefully you have some answers. So the one I want to focus in on, I love this quote, it's only artificial intelligence until you know what it does. After that, it's software. Right, so I think this really captures for me a lot about what is concerning about AI. Is that very often there's these neural nets and we can't describe them algebraically or analytically, and we don't know exactly what they do. And that's what's concerning. We don't know what their limits are. We put them on Twitter and they start doing things we couldn't have predicted. So this also just XKCD, I love that blog. You've got a pile of linear algebra and you stir it around a bit until it starts putting up the right answer. Very often what machine learning boils down to. So let's look, I'm going to show you now some examples of how this actually plays out at the moment. This first example I personally encountered. So credit rating, for those of you who are in machine learning, things like that, this is one of the most successful applications of machine learning at the moment. Credit rating agencies at the moment look at like 10, 20 data points that are usually a couple of years behind, that are very often inaccurate, they don't have all the information, and do a very bad job. So you've got a lot of people who deserve credit who don't get it, and you've got a lot of people who shouldn't be getting credits who get it, right? So it's a very bad system that the credit rating agencies use at the moment. Machine learning algorithms do very well on using large amounts of data points to say whether or not you should be extended credit. Under our National Credit Act, if a consumer is refused credit, then they can ask for reasons, right? So if you're now running this algorithm and someone comes to you and says, why didn't I get credit? And you say, well, we've got this box of GPUs that measured 10,000 data points of how quickly it took you to move your mouse across the page on our website, and it did some freaking magic, and sorry, there's no money for you, right? That sort of explanation is not going to hold up if you have to now go to court if someone sues you for why you weren't extended credit. So it's a bit of a trade-off because these systems are definitely more fair in how they're extending it, but they can't explain. So that is why there are a lot of efforts, and I know Dave and Chris both touched on this a bit, to try and open up the black box and see what are these things actually doing. And some of the people that are doing credit rating with machine learning are focusing on that quite a lot. Second example is quite interesting, again, because this is something AI seems to be doing quite a lot based on the data that we're feeding it, is discriminating. So in South Africa, at least, I don't think this is the case in too many countries, but in South Africa, when they drafted Section 9 of the Constitution and the legislation under that Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act, what they realized is that in almost every case of discrimination, the person who has the evidence is the person being accused, or the defendant, right? So the example we usually use is, say there's a racist innkeeper, and somebody comes to the inn and says, I'm looking for somewhere to stay, and they say, no, sorry, we're full, right? Who in that situation has the information to be able to prove whether or not that was actually discrimination or whether they were actually full? It's the innkeeper who's got all the books, right? And if you think about cases of discrimination, almost every single one is like that. The person who can prove what's going on, who has the information, is usually the accused. So what they do is they say, if the complainant makes out a case on face value that there was discrimination, then the burden of proof shifts. And you've got to explain why it wasn't discrimination or why it was justified if it was, right? So maybe it was a burden back and then it's justified discrimination. So the problem with that is that if you have a machine learning algorithm and it spits out, or whatever algorithm you've got, and it spits out results that are correlated to any of the listed grounds, right? That's race, sex, gender, marital status, nationality. There's a whole bunch of them. If your results are correlated with any of those, that is, at face value, indirect discrimination. The burden of proof now falls on you to show why that's okay. And if all you've got is this box that you don't know what it's doing, that's a big problem as well, right? So I think the upshot of all of this, which is something I want to stress right now, is that a lot of people are saying, should we regulate AI? You know, what are people doing? Well, it is already implicitly regulated by the laws, right? So in terms of existing laws for what you can and can't do with things, it's already implicitly restrained. The other big one, which I haven't got a slide on, is just bear in mind a lot, so in a second, Luke, artificial intelligence usually goes hand in hand with big data, and there's a lot of laws around privacy and what you can do with data and things like that. So there's already a lot that's going on.
No, it's just interesting to think that like one of the ways an AI could justify its decision is actually a way in which like people justify decisions every day, right? Which is just to say, look, I'm right a lot. Like, as in like if you look back at past examples and see an AI has classified something in the correct way retroactively many times, it's the same way a lot of humans justify their own decisions and their own appeals to other people's decisions, which is something that an AI can do now.
Can do really well.
And now.
Yeah. Yeah, so absolutely. So that is, I think intuitively, if you take an example where AI is doing better than people, producing more fair results, that does seem like a good justification for the system. The legal problem, and this is where you have to distinguish, is justification for the individual, right? So you might be right 90% more often than a person, but this particular guy wants to know the reasons that in his case, you said he's not getting credit, or you said this, or whatever. And that's where it gets tricky, right? So that's a trade-off that comes in over there. Okay. So then, just extending a bit further, liability at common law. So obviously what we try and do when we say we do have regulations and we've got this new thing is we look for analogies and we see how we might treat this. So at common law, if you want to sue someone, conduct, harm, causation, fault, wrongfulness, you've got to prove all of them. And if you look at liability for an omission, where you should have acted and where you didn't, then there's some commonly recognized categories, and one of them is control of a potentially dangerous object or animal, right? So that's potentially somewhere that AI could fall in. What's interesting about that is the word control again, right? So there's this constant tension in the law about when do you have control over something. If you create an AI and it goes and does a whole bunch of stuff, how much of that did you control? How much of that did you not? And if you couldn't control it, then where do we put the liability? Do we put it further back, or where do we do it over there? So key question is, what can we control? So I think Dave's already mentioned that we can control the model. I think the big thing that we can usually control is the objective function or the cost function. What are we trying to minimize and what are we trying to maximize? We can tell it that. And the inputs and outputs. So that's obviously, if you don't want to train the thing to be biased, don't give it biased input data. So those are the things that we can control. I've put Hanlon's razor over there. So Why did I put that in again? I'm not sure. Never mind, I'm not going to go into that now. But basically, those are some of the things that you can control. The concern there is that if you're controlling the objective and if you're controlling what's going in, but you're not controlling the process of how it's done, the question is that enough? And if you think of like some of your classic science fiction cases of like the 3 laws breaking down or something like that, or like someone says to an AI, you've got to do good for humans, and they realize that humans are the worst things for humans, and so they kill all humans. You know, those kind of things that science fiction books do, right? And those are all examples of this, where you tell the AI what goal you want, but you don't tell it how to get there, and then something happens that you didn't expect. So this is a piece by James Wink, is now Dr. Wink, from his PhD thesis. He's also a mate of Dave and I. So he writes about justifying chaos, and he says that you can't use the arguments that the means justify the ends when you don't know what the means are. In order to justify something, you've got to know what it is, right? Otherwise, what are you justifying? So this was a paper in legal philosophy, so somewhere between what Dave and I are doing, probably a bit more towards Dave's side. But that gives you some indication of the problem of control, right? Is what do you do when you can tell an AI what your objective function is, but you can't tell it what's going on in between. This is one attempted solution. Seems fairly obvious. Very often with law, by the way, you'll talk about problems in the abstract, and when it comes down to it in a specific case, they'll go with like very pragmatic solutions. So like this is one that's been proposed, which is just find out where the failure happened, find out who was responsible for that part, and hold them responsible. So that's one way of looking at it. So make sure that your senses work, make sure that you're translating your intent properly, that you can communicate with the AI, make sure it's properly tested. And then the last one is quite interesting, like have the thing warn you if it's starting to do something weird, so you can turn it off before it goes haywire. Okay, on to I think what's probably the most interesting question is, should AI be legal persons? So, does anyone know anything about legal personhood, like off the bat? No? Okay, sure. So, legal personality is something we give at the moment to people and that we give to companies. Perpetual succession, so companies get personhood because they're always around. Basically, what a legal person is anything that can have rights and duties. So, people have rights and duties, and companies have rights and duties, and you can own property as well. So it's got quite a dark history. Basically, it was used to prevent slaves from having rights and duties, and also to like give a lot of power in Roman law to the patriarch of the family. Also, some pretty bad example from colonialism, where like land disposition was facilitated by regarding some people as not legal persons. It's quite archaic at the moment. So like the partnerships business is almost comical in what happened there. Basically, a partnership is not a legal person. It's a type of company is not a legal person. So you weren't allowed to cite a partnership on court documents if you wanted to sue, because it's not a separate entity. So until I think it was like 4 or 5 years ago, if you wanted to sue a partnership, you had to name every single person in that partnership, and people would literally just like hide so that you couldn't sue them. Only very recently did they pass a law saying you can write the partnership's name on the court documents, even though it's not a legal person. So it's like very archaic, very formalistic things, but nonetheless, it's the basis of when we recognize you in law. Like the law doesn't see you until you're a legal person. Animals aren't legal people, right? So animals don't have rights and duties in law. We care about them only because people care about them and people have rights. So just interesting things to think about there. I'm going to chat a bit more about why it might be useful to sue an artificial intelligence in its own name, instead of trying to figure out who's behind it. But think about perpetual succession, right? So this is a big thing for companies, is that if someone leaves a partnership, you basically have to dissolve the whole thing and start from scratch. An incorporated company can carry on forever, even if the directors die. And artificial intelligence might have that quality as well, right? So what happens if I design an artificial intelligence, and then I die, and in 100 years' time that AI goes and does something evil? Who are you going to hold responsible? Right? So think about perpetual succession and the impact that might have. Okay, so there is a guy in America who thinks that there's already a way that you could make an AI into a legal person. Basically, you incorporate a company and then hollow it out again, leaving nothing but the AI. I'm doubtful of whether or not that can work. In South Africa, it's certainly not possible. There was one case where these directors of a mine were ordered to like clean up environmental damage they'd done, and the directors didn't want to do that, so they all resigned at the same time, leaving the company with nothing. It's just a hollow shell, and they actually got sued for resigning, and the court said they couldn't resign. So I don't think this method will work in South Africa. But the point is that people are already looking in America at trying to find ways to effectively make an artificial intelligence into its own legal person. Okay, here's the interesting part, right? So when it comes to agency, and why I think this is particularly interesting at the moment is because we're getting smart contracts. So at common law, an artificial intelligence can't act for you. It can't be an agent of you. You can only work through it, but it can't be a separate person who's an agent for you. So, what happens, for example, if you've got a trading platform and you tell your computer, trade when you think it's a good idea. Now, at the moment, that's not much of a problem because it's all pretty algorithmic. But if you're using an artificial intelligence to do those trades for you, and it makes some decision that you couldn't possibly have foreseen, and now the other person tries to bind you to that agreement, right, then there's complications there because that thing wasn't your agent. You couldn't foresee it coming through. So what happens in those sorts of situations? Can you rescind on that contract? And I think that the reason this is particularly interesting is because we're now getting smart contracts, right, which can enforce themselves. And I think something to think about, which, for me it's a really difficult question, is what happens when artificial intelligences start contracting with each other through smart contracts? What happens when they want to get out of one of those contracts? Something like that. So there's very interesting questions there where, if you want to now sue the other AI and you're an AI, it's got to start recognizing it as a legal person. Standards of care also threw this in because Dave mentioned it, and I think it is an interesting problem. So we have negligence in our law at the moment, and the test was put forward. Kruger versus Kutsia, this guy let a horse escape from his property and a car ran into it, and then they sued him for negligence. And it kind of set the precedent. And what they said is, if a reasonable person would have foreseen harm, and a reasonable person would have done something to avoid that harm, and you didn't, then you're negligent. And that's the test, 3 parts. The interesting thing is that when you're justifying human actions, and you're looking at, a reasonable person and what people would do, there's very often like a lot of excuses that we accept from people, but that we wouldn't accept from a machine. So what constitutes negligence for an artificial intelligence? Like, do we account for when it's in a high-pressure situation? Do we account for when it feels for its own situations, right? So how do we then start looking at reasonable behavior within the context of an artificial intelligence acting? Okay, what is the current legal opinion? Richard Kemp, he specializes in IT law. Quoted him earlier as well. So he says it's a fallacy that you mustn't think of AI as a legal person, that you must think of it as a tool of people. I think the shortcoming in how he puts things forward is that he is just talking about what the law is at the moment. So if somebody asks you, if you go home tomorrow and someone asks you about the legal position, don't tell them AI or people, they're not at the moment. So he's correct about that, right? Artificial intelligence has not got legal personality at the moment, it's nothing but a tool of people. But I do think what we need to start thinking about is, well, that's probably going to change, or at least we need to start thinking about how that might change. And that's where we need to start thinking about why is it that we might want to start holding AI directly accountable instead of trying to look for someone who was behind it and figure that out when no one is really controlling it. Yeah. So just with companies, for example, there's something called the directing minds doctrine, which is, in South Africa, you can hold a company criminally liable. You can't do that in a lot of countries, for example. But like you can hold a company guilty of a crime in South Africa. And then the person they actually end up punishing is they look at like who was the directing mind of the company when it made that decision. So they always try and put a person behind it. And I think a key thing to think about is whether you can always put a person behind the decision that an AI takes. Because I think a lot of times you can't, right? And then the question becomes, well, what can you hold accountable? Obviously you might be thinking like, well, how do you hold an AI accountable? Like you send it to jail or something. But obviously you have to think about it a bit differently. But I think you start looking at the spaces in which AI plays. If it is something like a contract, that the AI is undertaken, and there is room for accountability, and rescinding that contract or anything like that, where you do go against.
Just on holding persons responsible for the outcomes of a very complex system of things. Like a housing market collapse, like 2009 with the financial markets. Right? I don't know how many people were prosecuted for that or jailed. I think there was a documentary that was very cool, but close to none. And that's not necessarily AI, but the financial markets are very complicated things. But they were definitely built by people. There are people behind giving out loans for houses they shouldn't be giving out, or extended credit where they shouldn't, or I don't even know, these very consistent things. But we can't even prosecute or hold people responsible for something like that has devastating, far-reaching effects. How are we going to? Because I mean, no one person, it's not going to be. It'll be like a whole company, like we will all work together on an AI. So when it comes time to prosecute something.
Yeah, okay, so it's a very good question. I think what he's getting at is a question of evidence, which is basically, like another good example is people who are tried by international criminal courts for crimes against humanity. Is usually the more complex and the more horrific the thing, the more difficult it is to punish someone for it, which is exactly what you don't want. But certainly you can. But you are right. With increasing complexity, it gets more difficult to prosecute. So that is very often in situations like that, people look to civil law to try and help. So a good example is at the moment, there was a big push by the trade unions to introduce criminal provisions into the competition to prevent, so that if you compete unfairly as a company in the marketplace, then you can get criminal sanctions. And the regulators said, no, please don't do that, because then we have a much higher burden of proof, and we're not going to be able to hold anyone accountable at all. It's much better to only have civil liability, and then it's easier to do it. So that's one mechanism people use. So instead of sending it to jail, we're doing it tonight. And then it's faster and it's easier. And you have discovery of documents as well, which you don't have in criminal proceedings. So, yeah. Okay. Next, very interesting thing, right? So just before I go on to it, I think Chris put at the beginning, can we regulate AI? Will AI regulate us? And a lot of people are asking, when should we start regulating AI? When should we start regulating AI? If you start treating an AI as a legal person, they might start claiming rights. Say, well, we can't just regulate us, we also get to enforce our own situations. And that might sound absurd, but I thought I'd show you a piece from the first certification judgment. So Constitutional Court had a very difficult job. They had to basically say whether or not the Constitution could be passed. And someone took issue with rights being afforded to companies. And Constitutional Court has a very interesting argument here where they say, look, for a lot of rights, if you want to give them their proper effect, you have to give them to companies. So freedom of expression, for example, if you don't give that to media companies, then it's pretty much worthless. Like, it's media companies that need that right. And I see a similar argument potentially applying for AI, right? If AI, for example, especially starts creating like musical works or starts writing political opinions or whatever, can it then claim protection? Because you didn't create that, right? AI that like genuinely creates literature and creates art, you can't claim copyright as an author if you made the AI. It's too far removed. So the question there is, can the AI then defend in its own name its freedom of expression? And if you value freedom of expression as a concept in society, or whatever I'm talking about, there might well be situations where the AI should be able to claim that. So it's not just about regulating the AI, but when the AI defends itself, it's regulating you. And that might well be something that happens as well. Okay, bunch of other topics to go through. So this also was briefly touched on, yes?
The discussion on the personhood, I mean, what tests do we normally apply? There are situations where you're not person, like if you immigrated or
yes.
Minors.
Yes.
So what tests do we normally apply there to determine whether someone is like responsible or not? Are they transferable?
Yes. Okay. Very good question. So at the moment we only recognize as persons people and companies incorporated in terms of law, and then specific bodies formed by legislation. Those are the three categories. For people, when they actually figure out when you're a person and when you're not, there's like it's really funny. Like they literally like put sponges in your lungs. Like if a baby is born dead, and they want to figure out whether it was a person before it died, like whether it gets to inherit, they have like these medical tests to check whether or not it took a breath. That are like really specific. So, yeah. Yeah, it's really Frankfurt. It's like literally the difference between taking a breath after being born and not depends like who gets inherited. So there are like really bizarre specific tests for when you're a human. But the categories, there's no general criteria for the categories. There's those 3 categories and everything is free.
Yeah, I mean, specifically the human ones, and like, what, there's sort of, if you, I don't know, if you mentally challenged or something, and the test being got, what is the criteria where they say, no, you are a responsible person and you should have known ahead or reasonable person?
No, I understand. That's a good question. So personhood is broken down into various capacities. So there's like capacity to sue, there's capacity to be sued, there's capacity to like whatever. Obviously children have diminished capacity. So the test is usually A, do you understand the difference between right and wrong, and B, are you capable of acting in accordance with that distinction? And people often fail one of those 2 things. So very often children know the difference between right and wrong, but they're so impulsive. They just go and do something. And then you don't hold them accountable. So they have to move capacity in that way. So I guess then those are back to the person's philosophy. Does AI know the difference between right and wrong, and it act in accordance with that?
What happens if the child
Won't be responsible. You found a loophole, well done, Chris. You should be alone.
It's just been simple for humans because we're so genetically similar and therefore so similar.
Yeah.
But like now it becomes a real question, like for an AI, is it on the spectrum of being a person or not? Would you say that you need to actually have like people who are going to come into court, maybe philosophers, maybe AI themselves, and testify on, is this a person? I think you should. So,
okay, so
let me put my view on the matter out there.
Okay, so let me maybe just clarify. So when I say should AI be persons, it won't be the courts deciding, because the Constitution is clear on that. So when we talk about starting to regulate AI and changing the laws on it, we're mostly talking about the legislature changing the law. So they would have to take a decision to say, we're now going to make AI have these capacities. They do have to have public engagement before they pass laws, and you can come along and testify. But
I wouldn't want that to be general. I want that to be case specific.
Yeah. So that's also, it came up, I think it's fine that I'm getting distracted because it's interesting. It did come up earlier, the distinction between like case law and codified law. And in South Africa in particular, like almost every judgment that comes out these days says this must be decided on a case-by-case basis. And it really annoys lawyers because you go into a test and you're like, what's the law on this? And you're like, well, it depends on the case, right? And it's like that in like every case. But that is a tendency we go in. It makes the law much less predictable, but it makes it much more fair. That's the trade-off. But that is the direction we usually use. And we do get experts into courts when the court doesn't understand something. More recently, they've been getting more psychologists in, especially in sexual assault cases, which is good. But the limitations of the courts are quite pronounced in text. So in South Africa, for example, there's an average of only about 10 patent law cases a year, which is like more road claims than that in like 2 hours. And the reason, if you ask patent lawyers, is they'll say the judges just don't understand. Like, it's text. So there is a severe limitation on the courts for dealing with artificial intelligence. Malevolence. So yeah, just to point out, I do think this needs to be stressed explicitly. The people who are very often at the forefront of developing tech are not the good guys. Right? So there's a lot of discussion about can we make good AI and will it be good? What about the people expressly making bad AI? Keep them in mind as well. So just in terms of establishing intention there, that's also a slightly tricky question, because if I make an AI to do something bad, but I don't know what, I just make it that I know it's going to cause chaos. And then someone ends up dying in China. And then I say, well, I didn't know that was going to happen. That wasn't my intention, right? So who has seen like a bit of the Oscar Pistorius case at all? few people, right? So the advantage is a lot of people know what dolus eventualis means now because of that there. So Grunewald versus Grunewald is actually the best case on that about whether or not something was closely enough related. The guy was attacking his girlfriend and then he locked her in a room and left for a bit and she tried to escape and fell off the balcony and broke an arm and some other things. And he said, well, yeah, I was trying to assault her, but not like that. So I'm in the clear. Anyway, the test the court laid down there was basically you don't have to foresee exactly the harm, but you do have to foresee the general pattern or the general category. And I don't think that in a lot of cases AI will even fall into that. Like, what is it if you create something that's just meant to be destructive? Will you always even know the general category? So I think there might be a hole in the law over there. Okay, I think those are the main points. Do I have like 5 more minutes? Do I have 5 more minutes? Yeah or no? Yeah. Okay, cool. Then I'm just going to give you some more things to think about, some other really interesting problems that are popping up. So legal professional negligence, obviously one of the big things that AI does is it replaces professionals, right? You start getting intelligent systems. Lawyers are very scared of this. It's interesting because the legal profession has got a lot of ethical duties. And in fact, you don't really work for your client so much as what you're working for the courts and what you're working for the law. And the problem is when you start using these AI that are optimized to help you with researching law and with producing legal cases, is they're usually optimized for the client. So there's professional ethical issues as well about, you know, if you do have something that's really good at representing the client, but that isn't leading to the best legal outcomes, what are the implications there? Unemployment, I do think it's going to happen. I did see the slides about new jobs that AI will create. I don't think that that's going to be enough. The big thing that I'm concerned about as well is that existing jobs that are low down on the skills requirements are getting increased skills requirements. You can't do any job nowadays without knowing how a computer works. Right? Even if you're a cashier, there's some advanced systems you've got to learn. And so there's going to be a serious gap, I think, especially at the bottom of the skills tree for people who can't keep up with this technology and that are going to be losing jobs. So I am worried about whether we can train people effectively enough and whether we are going to have enough jobs for people who don't want to be involved. So that is a big concern. Open data, so again, as I said earlier, AI and big data pretty much go hand in hand. So the big question is access to data. And I think the law has a role to play in terms of making data more accessible and especially useful data, type of data we want to be using.
Should it be monitored? Because, for example, if you take like old statistical data and train gender gap is statistically proven in terms of pay. The contrasting was based on actually the human implementation of the bias, which turned out to be the largest statistical data sets. I mean, where, where we draw the line, a lot of data can also mean a lot of bullshit. So shouldn't mix with and then we end up again with racist AIs and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. So I think Dave spoke to that, and I agree with him that we do need to have standards. I think the bottom line to all of this, the actual regulations are going to end up being very complicated and it's going to take a long time to develop and going to be very case specific. The bottom line is we need professional standards, right? Like an architect who builds a building, they have professional standards they have to adhere to. And they have to get certified, and they have to be monitored, and they have to be audited. And I think that when it comes to making data available and using data, we need professional standards. It can't just be anyone who's 16-year-olds old with a basement, like making artificial intelligence. It needs to be a proper process. So that's kind of my answer to that question. But I think getting more data that has potential public utility into the public space is generally a good thing. So there's a lot of cities now that are making a lot of their data available and people being able to use that to help with service delivery and things like that. Thanks, Eva. Competition law. So obviously a lot of companies are going down very quickly at the moment and you're getting monopolies forming, big competition concerns. So we have something in South Africa called like I can't remember the exact term actually, but like important resource. So if you like own a cell phone tower and you're the only one in the city with a cell phone tower, you sometimes like have to let your competitors use it in terms of African competition law. AI obviously, like having such a massive advantage, has got potential implications for unfair competition amongst companies. This one I think is really cool. So for those who don't know, the Road Accident Fund is currently in a shitload of debt. So they're looking at changing to no fault liability because the cost of defending the cases costs more than what it would cost if they just pay people out. So they're looking to move towards that. But self-driving cars, potentially going to help with that a lot. Firstly, less accidents. Secondly, like all the evidence of what caused the accident. So dealing with, it's a massive expense. It's added to your fuel. I think there's a lot of ways that's going to help. Okay, I'm going to do one more and then I'm going to cut it off. I think this last one is just very interesting, which is legal causation, right? So anytime you charge someone with a delict or you charge someone with a crime, slightly wrong terminology, but anyway, then you have to show that they caused the thing. And so I'll tell you about, for example, Minister of Police versus Kosana, which is where a guy was in jail and he said he had a sore tummy and they didn't do anything about it for 12 hours. And when he got to the hospital and he had an operation, it was too late and he died. So now the court had to sit and think, well, if they had taken him 6 hours earlier, would he still have died? What would have happened? To determine whether or not the negligence on the part of police had caused his death. And sometimes these cases just get ridiculous, like because it goes so far into conjecture about what might have happened. So when it comes to predicting alternatives and being able to know what caused what, having big data and having strong predictive algorithms might play a very big role there. The flip side, though, and I think this is something lawyers should be scared of, is that we're going to come closer towards realizing the strength of determinism when it becomes so easy to predict things. And when that happens, then a lot of the theory that underlies the law is in a lot of danger because we realize actually, it was just this random sequence or things that coincided that caused the situation. It wasn't really his fault. We're going to have to seriously consider how we assign responsibility, and we're going to seriously have to consider how we think about legal causation. So bottom line is a lot of topics. I think what's needed is professional ethics and professional standards. But exciting stuff. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. I think we'll save the questions for like the more informal settings so that we sit down and sit. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming through. I think I had the easiest job because technology is so easy to just do. They had to talk about the difficulty of law and regulation and moral. So I got let off quite easy. Please, there's a form in the back left by the glasses. Please write any suggestions you have for future meetups. Great to hear your feedback. And of course, we're going to, well, at least I'm going to be around a little bit longer in the back if you guys want to talk. Always keen to chat with like-minded individuals. So thank you for coming through. And last, asking all lots of questions. Thanks, Chris. So your slideshow stopped working. Appreciate it.